I am Marissa, 32 years old, and I never believed a single door could split my life into a before and after. Yet there I was, standing in front of my mother-in-law's grand house, clutching a casserole I had spent hours preparing. The door opened, and her face lit up as she pulled my husband, David, inside with a smile. Then her eyes landed on me, cold as stone. She shifted her body across the doorway, her voice low but sharp enough to cut straight through me. "No, not you," she said. And before I could breathe, the door slammed shut. That sound still rings in my ears, my entire world excluded in a single moment. What happens next, and who stands with me, changed everything. But my story didn't begin that night. Before the door ever closed on me, there was the life that shaped how I entered David's world in the first place. I grew up in a modest Boston neighborhood where people worked hard just to hold things together. My father drove a delivery truck for 30 years, and my mother worked as a secretary at an elementary school. They didn't have much money or influence, but they gave me something I would never trade: the conviction that persistence matters. When something is worth holding on to, you don't let go. That belief shaped how I saw love, commitment, and family. I thought hard work and loyalty could bridge any gap if you gave people time. I thought persistence could earn me a place anywhere. What I didn't know then was that some doors slam no matter how hard you knock. I was 26 when I met David at a friend's engagement party. The room was full of chatter, music spilling from an old sound system, and plates of food balanced in every hand. It was the kind of chaotic, crowded gathering where most conversations blurred together until his stood out. He carried himself in a way that suggested he never had to second-guess his place anywhere. When he noticed me and struck up a conversation, it felt oddly natural, as if we'd been picking up a thread rather than starting from scratch. He was attentive in ways I appreciated, laughing at my dark little jokes, asking questions, and remembering small details I mentioned. Those gestures were what first pulled me in. Our relationship escalated quickly. What began with weekend dinners soon turned into spontaneous road trips. Late-night phone calls stretched until mornings, and within months, he proposed during a quiet weekend trip to Cape Cod. To me, it didn't feel rushed. It felt inevitable, like I had finally found someone who saw me completely and wanted to build a life together. I thought I was building a bridge. What I didn't realize was that Beverly was already setting fire to it. Still, underlying all of that was a divide I tried to push aside. I grew up in a world of patched roofs, discount store furniture, and vacations that meant day trips to the shore. David had come from marble counters, manicured lawns, and the unspoken ease of generational money. His family name mattered in rooms before he even walked into them. I convinced myself it wouldn't matter. Love seemed enough to close the distance between our two upbringings. I believed that respect and effort could earn me a place among his family, even if I came from somewhere simpler. That belief carried into my first interactions with them. His mother, Beverly, was present from the very beginning. At our engagement dinner, she sat across the table, polished, composed, every glance as sharp as her jewelry. She asked questions that weren't meant to learn who I was, but to test what I lacked. Beverly had a way of making observations that sounded polite on the surface, while her expression left no doubt she was measuring me against a standard I would never meet. Her smile looked warm to everyone else. To me, it felt like the first test I didn't know I was already failing. David's father, William, was quieter, preferring small nods and short remarks, while his sisters hovered on opposite sides, one visibly detached, the other dismissively curious. From the start, I felt something was off. A pause in conversation when I entered a room, a faint smirk when I shared a memory. One of his sisters once interrupted a light-hearted story to wonder aloud if I even traveled much, before quickly adding, "Oh, sorry, maybe that's not as familiar for you." The words were framed as innocent, but they landed like stones. Beverly, in particular, seemed to revel in those subtle cuts. She didn't raise her voice or insult me directly. She simply found ways to remind me I was an outsider. At first, I rationalized it all. I told myself wealth came with different manners, ones I just hadn't learned to navigate. I believed that once they saw my dedication to David and felt the sincerity in my intentions, their attitude would soften. I thought marriage would settle the divide, that standing by his side as his wife would finally earn me the respect I hadn't yet been given. But looking back, the signs were already there. Beverly's studied glances, the carefully veiled remarks, the silences designed to make my presence shrink down to nothing. I chose to overlook them because of what I wanted so desperately: to belong to the family I thought I was marrying into. That choice blinded me to the truth that had been forming from the very start. And it wasn't just in the big gatherings or formal introductions. The signs surfaced in ways so subtle they could almost be dismissed until their weight built into something impossible to ignore. Beverly's war against me was never waged with raised voices or direct insults. It was subtle, stretched across family gatherings where everything looked perfect on the surface, but carried an undertow strong enough to pull me down. Her strategy was exclusion, dressed as normalcy, reminders that no matter how close I stood, I wasn't truly inside her circle. One of the first times I felt it clearly was during a holiday dinner. Someone suggested a family photo, chairs scraped back, people stood up, and the group began clustering together in front of the fireplace. I stepped forward, waiting for the gap to open where I might fit. But bodies shifted, shoulders locked, and by the time the camera clicked, I was either pushed to the very edge or left out completely. Later, when the prints came back, there I was, blurred at the corner, or worse, missing. A whole memory preserved without me in it, as if I hadn't been there at all. The same message repeated itself in quieter moments. At a formal gathering her family hosted, servers moved about with trays of champagne. Each time they reached our side of the table, a glass slipped easily into David's hand, another to his sister, another to Beverly. When they reached me, the tray turned away. No eye contact, no pause. It happened again as hors d'oeuvres circled the room. David nudged me slightly when he noticed, but when I whispered that it had happened before, he only said, "Maybe the server didn't see you." Yet it wasn't just once. By the end of that night, I had been bypassed so many times, it became impossible to mistake it for accident. And while Beverly never said a word, her glance across the table told me she saw it too, and approved. Each dismissal felt small on its own, but together they were rehearsals for the night she'd finally erase me completely. I didn't know then that every slight was a rehearsal, a build-up to the night she would finally close me out completely. Then there were the comparisons, each one sharpened like a blade, disguised as casual memory. Julia always had a gift for putting people at ease, Beverly would remark in conversations, tilting her glass as though it was an afterthought. Or she would recall how flawless Julia looked hosting a dinner years ago, her praise aimed at the room while her gaze bored into me. Julia wasn't just David's ex. She was Beverly's standard, the daughter-in-law she had wanted. Each mention was a reminder that in her eyes, I wasn't an addition to the family, only a substitution that fell short. The pattern wasn't abstract. It took from me piece by piece. After every gathering, I returned home drained, not only from smiling through her tests, but from the quiet certainty that my efforts would never be enough. The ignored gift still unopened on a table, the absent place in a photograph, the comparisons whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Each left me a little smaller. Over time, I found myself rehearsing responses in the mirror, planning outfits too carefully, cooking dishes I hoped would impress, all in the hope that one more attempt at perfection might open a crack in that wall. But her silence remained stronger than my effort, and the weight of it collected inside me like stones I didn't know how to set down. David called it just her way. He wanted me to ignore the patterns, telling me Beverly was protective, particular, unable to see anyone as good enough. What he couldn't understand was that dismissal left me exposed. By insisting it was unintentional, he left me fighting battles on my own, apologizing for hurt that wasn't imagined, but orchestrated. Looking back, I can see each slight as a carefully placed marker, not random moments, but pieces of a story building toward one truth. Beverly's war was never meant to shout me down. It was meant to erase me, gently and completely, until the rest of the family didn't even notice I was gone. And all of it led to the moment when her quiet campaign finally became undeniable. The day a single door drew the line she had always wanted between me and them. It happened on the night of the family reunion, when Beverly's silent campaign finally revealed itself without disguise. Her house loomed on the corner lot, tall and bright, every window spilling golden light, as though to flaunt what waited inside. The driveway was already lined with polished cars, their hoods gleaming under the street lamps. I parked half a block away and made the walk with my casserole balanced carefully in my arms. I had chosen the recipe with precision, something familiar, praised by my own family, a dish that carried comfort in its warmth. My clothes had been chosen with the same care. Not too formal, not too casual, each thread a quiet attempt to leave no opening for dismissal. As David and I stepped onto the stone porch, the muffled sound of laughter floated through the walls, voices rising and falling in that easy rhythm of people unburdened in each other's company. For a second, just outside the doorway, I let myself imagine being welcomed into it. Plates passed across the table, my dish joining the others, my place in the circle recognized instead of questioned. That fragile hope had been enough to carry me here, casserole in hand. David knocked, unhesitating, the sound barely settled before the door opened wide. Beverly stood framed in the glow of the foyer. Her jewelry caught light with every movement, her smile stretching as soon as her eyes landed on her son. "David," she exclaimed, pulling him close, wrapping her arms around him as though nothing in the world could match this reunion. Her laughter rang out, threaded with delight, and for a few moments, the warmth pouring from her was undeniable. Then her gaze shifted toward me, the glow drained away. She didn't step aside, didn't extend a hand. Her smile softened into a thin line, polite only in form. Her eyes flicked to the casserole I was holding, lingering as if the offering itself was an affront. She adjusted her stance, her shoulder angling across the doorway, her body a barrier between me and the room behind her. The message slid across the silence. Not you. I tried to bridge the space, ready to greet her, ready to extend what I had carried so carefully. But my words never left me. Beverly's chin lifted, her mouth setting with finality. The door pushed forward. The slam cracked against the night, muffled for the crowd inside, but thunderous on the porch. It reverberated through me the way a sudden shove might. The casserole shifted in my grip, nearly slipping, as if even it had been rejected. My skin prickled with heat, my chest hollowed out. The sounds inside went on without pause, glasses clinking, voices rising in easy celebration. I stood still, pierced by the weight of silence outside. A neighbor appeared at the end of the walkway, pausing when they caught sight of me. Their eyes flickered quickly across the scene, casserole in hand, locked out on the porch, before darting away. They quickened their pace, head down, pretending not to notice. That fleeting acknowledgement from someone outside the family cut sharper than if no one at all had seen. And then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting David, imagining for a fleeting heartbeat that he'd texted to explain, to correct, to open the door back up. Instead, the screen flashed 2 words: "Wait outside." My stomach dropped, the glow of the screen burning into me. No defense, no protest, no confusion, just instruction. It didn't come from Beverly. It came from him. That text was small, but it made the pattern plain. It forced me to decide. I stayed rooted to the doorstep, casserole pressed against me, every trace of sound from inside amplifying the fact that I was separate. I didn't knock again. I didn't plead. The rejection wasn't hidden anymore, and now it carried my husband's name alongside hers. I could feel the cool air tightening across my skin, my heartbeat slowing from shock into something heavier. The porch felt colder with every second that passed, the laughter inside becoming more distant, more unreachable. And in that moment, I understood what I hadn't allowed myself to see before, that the wound wasn't only about Beverly's refusal, it was about David's silence. What happens when the deepest pain is not being shut out by those who never wanted you in, but realizing the one person meant to stand with you has stepped away? I stood frozen on that doorstep, the casserole cooling in my arms, my phone screen still glowing. Two words stared back at me, "Wait outside." I read them once, then again, aloud, in a whisper, as if the sound of the message would help me believe it. The syllables hung in the cold air, stinging sharper than the slam of the door itself. I let the pause linger, silent but heavy. My legs stayed rooted where I was, my body numb as though the command had pinned me there. The house carried on without me. Through the window pane above the door, a ripple of laughter floated outside, warm and effortless. That single sound contrasted with the silence pressing in around me, carving the distance between us more clearly than any words could. I was there, holding out something I had prepared with care, while joy spilled freely inside. The line was drawn. I clenched the casserole dish a little tighter, gripping it almost too hard, because abandoning it on the step would have felt like abandoning myself. I didn't scream or knock again or plead. Part of me considered it, the sudden burst of anger that wanted to force the issue. But something firmer rose in its place. A refusal to give Beverly the performance she was waiting for. Making a scene would have confirmed every assumption she held, cementing the idea that I didn't belong. So I straightened my shoulders, breathed evenly, and stayed quiet. The minutes blurred together, long and punishing, not because of what I did, but because of what I absorbed. Each new sound became sharper against the stillness outside, the clink of glasses raised in a toast, voices layering in that rhythm of shared stories, a swell of applause, likely for a speech, and then, from somewhere upstairs, the echo of children's laughter spilling out through a cracked window. That light, high laughter carried into the night, clear as bells, and it seemed to ring directly against my isolation. One single sound, highlighting the fact that I wasn't just alone. I was excluded, purposefully and completely. I checked the phone again, not because I expected a new message, but because I couldn't help looking. The words hadn't changed. Wait outside. That instruction revealed something I had never wanted to recognize out loud, that my absence wasn't an oversight, it was compliance. Beverly had set the terms, and David hadn't challenged them. By repeating her boundary in his voice, he placed her authority above my place beside him. That realization tightened across my chest, heavier than the cool night air ever could. I stayed put, even as the air grew colder. I told myself that leaving too quickly would mean surrender, a retreat on their terms. I didn't want to give Beverly that image, me walking away defeated, casserole still untouched. So I stayed still until the field of sounds inside began to soften, blending into one another. The movements of the night carried on without me, just as they had intended, and the rhythm of my stillness became its own answer. The porch had grown cold beneath my feet, and I was beginning to wonder how much longer I could stand there with my dignity intact when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, different from the muffled shuffle of party guests inside. These came from within the house, but moved toward the front door. Not the hurried click of heels I'd expected if David had finally come looking. These were heavier, measured, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had made a decision and was following through on it. The front door opened with a careful quietness, as if whoever was behind it didn't want to announce their exit to the party inside. I turned, expecting to see David or maybe one of his sisters sent to deliver another message. Instead, William stepped out. David's father. The man who usually said 3 words per gathering and spent most family events nodding politely from his leather chair, he closed the door behind him with the same careful silence, then turned to face me. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, me still clutching my casserole-like armor, him studying my face in the dim porch light. His expression carried something I'd never seen before. Not the distant politeness I was used to, but something sharper, clearer. "You don't deserve this," he said simply. The words hit me like a physical thing. After hours of standing in manufactured silence, hearing someone acknowledge what had happened felt like breaking the surface after being held under water. "She's wrong," he continued, his voice steady. "Come with me." I blinked at him, still clutching my casserole. "I... what?" "Come with me," he repeated. "I'm not leaving you standing here like this." He walked toward the driveway without looking back, his steps sure and unhurried. I followed, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. He opened the passenger door of his Mercedes, waited until I was settled, then slid behind the wheel. "Where are we going?" I asked as we pulled away from the house. The golden windows grew smaller in the side mirror. "Somewhere you'll be treated with respect." 20 minutes later, we were seated at Le Bernardin's sister restaurant, crystal glasses, pristine white tablecloths, servers who moved like dancers, the kind of place where reservations were booked months ahead, but William's name had opened doors instantly. He ordered champagne without asking what I wanted. When the server poured, the bubbles caught the candlelight like tiny stars. I took a sip and felt the first warmth I'd experienced all evening. "For years," William began, his voice quiet but firm, "I let her dictate everything, who was in, who was out." He paused, swirling the champagne in his glass. "I lost friends. I lost respect. I even lost myself." I set my glass down carefully. This was more than William had said to me in 3 years combined. "But tonight," he continued, meeting my eyes across the table, "when she slammed that door in your face, I saw my younger self, the part of me she shut down decades ago." His jaw tightened, and I realized, I'm done. The validation hit me like a wave. For the first time since I'd married into this family, someone was acknowledging what I'd endured. Someone was calling it what it was. "You knew?" I whispered. "All this time, you knew what she was doing?" "I knew," he said simply, "and I was a coward for not stopping it." The server appeared with caviar service, tiny pearls on mother-of-pearl spoons. I'd never eaten caviar before, but William ordered it like it was as natural as breathing. The first taste exploded across my tongue, briny, complex, luxurious. "This is how you should always be treated," he said, watching me savor each bite. With dignity, with celebration. My phone started buzzing during the second course. David's name flashed across the screen again and again. "Where are you? You just left me here with everyone. Mom is furious. Come back and fix this." I showed William the messages. He glanced at them and shook his head. 35 years old and still asking you to fix his mother's tantrums," he said. "I failed him as a father." Another buzz. "Everyone's asking where you went." Then, "This is embarrassing. Come back now." I stared at that last message, feeling something shift inside me. For months, I'd been the one embarrassed. I'd been the one shrinking, apologizing, trying to smooth over situations I hadn't created. Now, David was embarrassed. Now, he was uncomfortable. I picked up my phone and opened the camera. "What are you doing?" William asked. Something I should have done months ago. I held up the phone, angled it to capture both of us at the elegant table. The caviar service gleamed in the foreground. William raised his champagne glass slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I smiled too, the first genuine smile I'd felt all evening. The camera clicked. I typed quickly, "Out at a Michelin-starred restaurant with the only Harrington who treats me like family. Send." The response was immediate. My phone exploded with notifications. David calling again. Text after text flooding in. What the hell? "Dad left? Mom is losing it. Get back here now. I turned the phone face down on the white tablecloth and took another sip of champagne. You realize what this means? William asked. That I finally grew a spine? That the truth is finally out in the open. He leaned back in his chair. Beverly built her power on secrecy, on making people think her cruelty was normal. But now everyone at that party knows I chose to leave with you instead of staying with her. Back at the house, I could only imagine the scene unfolding. David trying to explain where his father had gone. Beverly's polished mask cracking as whispers spread through the family. Her carefully constructed narrative that I was the problem, the outsider who didn't belong, crumbling as her own husband publicly rejected her behavior. The phone kept buzzing. More texts from David, then from his sister, even from his cousins. Word was spreading through the reunion like wildfire. She's making a fool of me, I could almost hear Beverly hissing to anyone who would listen. But for once, she was the one being talked about. She was the one who had lost control. The divorce papers came within a week. I didn't hear it from William. I heard it from David, his voice breaking on the phone, panicked, like a child who had just lost his footing. Dad says he's been planning this for years, David stammered. He says Mom's treatment of you was just the final straw. William hadn't acted on impulse. He had receipts, journals, records. Decades of Beverly's control laid out in neat lines, her exclusions, her manipulation, her cruelty disguised as standards. The portrait was undeniable. She hadn't just hurt me, she had hurt everyone. The family split. Some defended Beverly, swearing she was misunderstood. But others, cousins, aunts, even old friends, spoke up. Quiet voices that had stayed silent for years finally named what they had endured. Stories matched mine like puzzle pieces, a decades-long pattern impossible to ignore. The days after the family split carried a weight neither of us could ignore. The voices that had finally spoken up against Beverly echoed in our apartment, their truth impossible to unhear. For once, the silence at home wasn't only mine. David moved through the rooms, distracted, his usual defenses faltering under the weight of what had been revealed. And when he finally sat across from me at the kitchen table, there was no sigh, no dismissal, only a quiet sentence that startled me. I think I've been letting her control my whole life, he said. The words hung there, unfamiliar and raw. After years of denial, hearing him name it out loud felt almost unreal. I wanted to rush into forgiveness, but something steadier held me in place. I had learned too much to confuse apology with change. I hear you, I told him, keeping my voice calm. But things can't go back to how they were. If this is real, something has to change. Nights stretched long as we talked, more than we had in months. He admitted he had grown up in her shadow, trained to smooth over every storm rather than confront it. What had felt like neutrality to him had been betrayal to me. Naming it together was the first step, but it wasn't enough. That's when he surprised me again. "We need help," he said one evening, his hands tight around a mug of untouched coffee. Counseling, not just for us, but for me, to unlearn all this. So we went. The first sessions were clumsy, his voice halting, my own cautious. But sitting across from someone who named the patterns gave us both clarity. The therapist spoke words I had only read in quiet late-night searches. Enmeshment, control, boundaries. For David, it was like hearing his childhood mapped in a language he had never been taught. For David, it was like reading his own childhood diary aloud for the first time. For me, it was confirmation I hadn't imagined the architecture of exclusion. I stayed grounded. I told him openly that my trust wasn't repaired by sessions on a calendar. It would take action, real boundaries set, real defense of our marriage, not just words spoken in a quiet room. And to his credit, he didn't shrink from it. The next major family gathering was David's birthday. Before Beverly could establish the guest list, William had already sent invitations from his downtown apartment. His house now, his rules. The room brimmed with chatter and clinking glasses. Long tables heavy with platters of food arranged in William's new dining space. To an outsider, the scene may have looked like effortless celebration, but for me, it was a stage where the family's fractures lay barely concealed beneath polite smiles and careful positioning. For the first hour, conversations flowed with practiced normalcy, though undercurrents of tension rippled through every exchange. Beverly had arrived precisely on time. Not her usual, fashionably late entrance, her posture rigid as she navigated William's new furniture, new artwork, new life. She greeted relatives with her polished charm, but her eyes held the brittle brightness of someone performing under scrutiny. When our gazes met across the room, hers carried a weight I had never seen before. Blame, sharp and unforgiving. David folded easily into the flow of his family, as though the months of upheaval had never happened. Cousins clustered around the birthday cake, voices layering in that rhythm of shared stories. But each conversation felt measured, careful not to reference the elephant in the room. William moved through his guests with quiet confidence. No longer the background figure I remembered. This was his space, his rules, and everyone could feel the shift in power. When Beverly finally cornered me near the kitchen, her voice dropped to a hiss meant only for my ears. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, her composure cracking like ice. 32 years of marriage, destroyed because you couldn't handle a little family tradition. You manipulated him, turned him against his own wife, all because you were too weak to— Beverly, that is enough. William's voice cut through her words like a blade. He had appeared beside us, without either of us noticing, his expression harder than I had ever seen it. The nearby conversations faltered as heads turned toward the sudden sharpness in his tone. Beverly's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing with the fury of being interrupted, but William wasn't finished. "This is exactly why we're divorced," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "This need to blame everyone else for consequences that came from your own choices, your own cruelty." His eyes swept the gathered family, landing on faces that had witnessed years of Beverly's subtle warfare. "Marissa didn't destroy our marriage. You did. Every time you excluded her, every time you made her feel unwelcome in her own family. I watched it happen for years, and I said nothing. That was my failure." The silence that followed was absolute. Forks hung suspended over half-eaten cake. Wine glasses stayed frozen halfway to lips. Beverly stood rigid, her carefully constructed mask finally shattered in front of everyone who had once deferred to her authority. "And now," William said, raising his voice just enough to address the entire room, "we're going to celebrate my son's birthday the way it should be celebrated, with kindness, with inclusion, with respect for everyone at this table." Beverly's hand trembled as she set down her wine glass. Without a word, she gathered her purse and coat, her exit swift and wordless. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more final than any slam. The room remained frozen for a heartbeat longer. Then slowly, conversations resumed. Quieter at first, then building back to the natural rhythm of family celebration. But everything had changed. The truth was finally out in the open, spoken by the one person whose word carried the most weight. The weeks that followed William's intervention at David's birthday brought a different kind of quiet to our house. Not the heavy silence of unspoken resentment, but the careful stillness of two people learning to rebuild trust. David had finally seen what I'd been trying to tell him for years. Not through my words, which he'd dismissed, but through his father's public acknowledgement of a truth he could no longer deny. The first therapy session was awkward, filled with long pauses and David's defensive explanations. But as weeks turned into months, something shifted. He began to hear not just what I was saying, but what I had been living. The casual dismissals, the birthday parties where I felt like a stranger, the family photos where somehow there was never quite enough room. "I thought I was keeping peace," he admitted during one particularly difficult session, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I was just choosing the easier path. I was choosing her comfort over your dignity." That was the first time I heard him say it, out loud, and it changed everything. It wasn't a magic cure. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to resurface. But for the first time since we'd married, David was fighting for our relationship instead of against it. He was learning to see Beverly's behavior not as protective mothering, but as the systematic exclusion it had always been. The real test came when Beverly tried one last manipulation, a tearful phone call to David claiming she was devastated by the family's betrayal. I watched him listen, saw the old guilt try to take hold, but then he did something that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I love you, but what you did to Marissa was wrong. Until you can acknowledge that, we can't move forward." He hung up and looked at me with eyes that finally saw clearly. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for making you fight alone for so long." The apology didn't erase the years of hurt, but it began something new. A marriage where I wasn't constantly defending my right to exist in it. A partnership where my feelings mattered as much as his family's comfort. A relationship built on the foundation it should have had from the beginning. Two people choosing each other completely and without reservation. That night, as we sat together on our couch, David reached for my hand, his fingers intertwined with mine, not grabbing, not pulling, just connecting. "We're going to be okay," he said quietly. For the first time in years, I believed him. If you've ever faced rejection from an in-law, know you are not alone. Share your story in the comments. Have you ever been shut out, and how did you respond? Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded they deserve respect, and subscribe for more stories of resilience. Because even when doors close, dignity remains the key we carry with us.